Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our Adapting and Innovating Beyond COVID-19 webinar series. Today's webinar is focused on financial assistance for COVID-19. My name is Thuraya Al-Naim, and I'm the Program Coordinator for Access Community Capital Fund. We are a registered charity with the aim to give everyone in our community the opportunity to reach their potential through sustainable employment and self-employment. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, please visit our website at accessccf.com. Before we get started, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items. So if you're new to Zoom, the menu bar is located at the bottom of your screen. In the menu bar, you can find the video, sound, chat box, and Q&A chat box. For the purpose of this webinar, all attendees' mics have been muted to ensure the best sound quality. If you have any questions for this speaker, please type them into the Q&A chat box, and we'll do our best to have our speaker address your questions during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical related issues or general questions, please use the general chat box for those items rather than the Q&A chat box. So today we have with us Mr. Adam Vaughan. He is has been elected to the House of Commons twice and also serves 2 terms as Toronto City Councillor. He currently represents the Toronto riding of Spadina-Fort York and serves as Parliamentary Secretary for Housing under the Honourable Adam Hussain, Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. At the federal level, Mr. Vaughan played a key role in developing Canada's first ever national housing strategy. Just to let you guys all know that Mr. Vaughan has been called to lead a committee meeting, so has to sign off at 10:30. So without further ado, I'll pass things on to Mr. Vaughan. Oh, you're muted, so just unmute.
Zoom etiquette. Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about some of the challenges we're currently going through, some of the opportunities that may emerge from these challenges as we start to recover and rebuild the economy, but also what supports are there in place now to help people weather the storm. Practice, of course, the good social isolation requests that be made of us, but at the same time also support people by continuing to support and participate in the economy and making sure that employment and other opportunities that were there before COVID are sustained through this period, but also coming out of the pandemic are in a place to thrive as well. The range of supports are sort of framed first and foremost by supporting people. Supporting individuals with lost income primarily, but then as we grow from people out to the larger macroeconomic questions, to make sure that the supports are also there for new businesses, emerging businesses, and established businesses, so that they can find the bridges they need to get past the shutdown and move into spaces that they can thrive in afterwards. They take a series of different forms, and they aren't just unique to individuals and small businesses. They also include things like nonprofits and charities, community foundations. They also are there to help businesses adapt for the time being and change business models as economic conditions change. There are programs in place to help with rent, to help with loans, to help with a whole series of things. If you're adapting your business to respond to COVID, there are also components and opportunities there. And additionally, as we start to mobilize the business sector and mobilize the creative sector as well, there are ways to talk acquire goods and services to tap into some of those markets as
We seem to be having some technical issues. Okay, there you are. You froze a little bit. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. And so really, I think the easiest thing to do here is, as we talk about the all-government response, is to really open up to questions and let me tie in answers to specific questions to detail some of the challenges we have, because we know there are some gaps and thresholds which challenge, in particular, smaller emerging businesses. But we also know that while communication is a miracle, it's never impossible, and we can always link you up to government programs through our websites, through MP offices to get you the support you need, either to keep people employed, to keep the doors open, or to support staff during this critical time. And with that, I'll throw it back to the hosts and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you so much. So if you have any questions, please post them on the Q&A chat box. So we'll start off with some questions that we received. So if someone's self-employed but hasn't had any income for a few months, do they qualify for any assistance?
Yeah, the CERB rules have been criticized as exclusionary, but the access is a very open and trusting one. And so when I've been given challenges like this, because in my riding there is a significant cultural sector employment base, as well as a lot of people who work in the gig economy through the tech sector, people who may work at 3 or 4 different work sites with 3 or 4 different contracts. The guidelines around CERB are, are you going to lose income for 14 consecutive days over the next month? You may or may not get contracts over the next month, but if you have no predictable or no clear sight line to those contracts, it's not hard for you to swear that you don't think you will get paid or have work for 14 straight days. It's not a, it's not a, they're not going to ask you to prove it. They're going to ask you to swear to it. And the difference there is that we are trying to be supportive. We're trying to help people isolate. And if you think that you're in a position where you are going to lose those contracts over the next month, by all means apply for CERB. You don't have to be able to sort of say it'll be between the 3rd and the 17th that I will have no contracts. That's not the issue. The issue is it likely that you're not going to have those contracts, or is that something you could predict reasonably? If you do get contracts, if you do start to earn income because you get called back, or firms are starting to open up again as provincial rules change, the correction to the payment of the CERB will be done through next year's tax system. So keep that in mind, that CERB is not taxed at support. It's delivered to you as whole dollars now to be taxed later. And the part of the way we're universalizing it, or we're turning it into a sort of a means tested benefit, is that if all of a sudden, sort of COVID lifts and the pandemic's over and business opens up and you're back to doing very, very well again, at that point it'll be modeled into your income, and you'll have to carry a tax burden on it. But in the short term, and when you're looking forward in the short term, if you don't think you can put food on the table or pay your rent, by all means enroll in CERB and get the support you need to do things safely now. And then we will figure out how to exit this period in a year's time when the new tax rules come out to accommodate. So yes, you can, but you have to be generous in the way you apply the CERB rules to yourself, because it's a simple attestation, you don't really have to worry about massive amounts of documentation to qualify. It's not as complex as, say, EI is.
Thank you. Another question is there help for residential rent if your landlord is expecting the full amount per month?
So CERB is meant to be that. We looked at, there are a number of different exceptionalities in people's lives that challenge us as income sources start to dry up. So what we looked at was do we try and feather dollars into several distinct programs, or do we do one basic program that people can access? And so there is one basic income, and that's the one that is meant to support people, and then let people in their households make the decisions that need to be made. On the rent situation, we have just launched, as part of the National Housing Strategy, a new Canada Housing Benefit. And this is a program that's cost-shared with provinces and territories. It's a $4.4 billion program. It existed before COVID. The rules and regulations are determined by the provinces. They have yet to roll it out. And we're a little bit shocked, maybe a little bit angry at times, but certainly puzzled as to why a rent support program, which we put in place as part of our response to the housing crisis long before the COVID crisis, has been sat on by the provinces. From BC to Nova Scotia, from Ontario to the Northwest Territories, and all spaces in between, they're sitting on a rent support program that could be in effect right now. Ontario had promised to launch it as of April 1st and have done virtually nothing. So the provincial residential rent space jurisdictionally is provincial space. That's why it's the provinces that have suspended evictions, the provinces that are in charge of rent control and landlord-tenant law. And so when we designed the Canada Housing Benefit, we designed it to be flowed through provinces and territories to dovetail with their social assistance programs and some of their existing rent programs, but they've done nothing. And so people are asking for some sort of, and I've seen one of the opposition leaders call for a national moratorium on rent. We have no mechanism, legal or political or jurisdictionally, to do that. But what we have done is sent literally hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a $4.4 billion program, hundreds of millions of dollars to every province, and no one's asking them to spend the money. They're telling us to spend the money, but we've already spent it, and we've delivered it to provinces. And provinces, quite frankly, have I think, a moral, if not an economic obligation to step up and start to manage that file. But there is no federal rent program moving forward at this point in time because that one hasn't been spent yet. And we're curious as to why people aren't asking the provinces for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question is, my wife arrived as an immigrant in November 2019. She doesn't qualify for CRB benefits as she hasn't earned over $5,000 the past 12 months. What help can she expect, if any?
So if she has a SIN number, if she's a permanent resident and has a SIN number, she wouldn't qualify for CERB because of those qualifications. She would qualify for some of the other elements like the GST rebate that we doubled, and if there are children in the family, the Canada Child Benefit is also being doubled this month to accommodate some of the challenges. But in that case, she would be covered by existing provincial social service programs, and that's where she would apply.
Thank you. Is there any assistance available for parents that need childcare?
That's an interesting challenge because it's this recovery has impacted women in very profound ways. The unemployment numbers show that women were in two categories. They're either most likely to lose their job or most likely being asked to work in very precarious workplaces, personal support workers in the hospitals and long-term care. And one of the reasons that women have stopped working is as schools closed down and as families became ill and quarantine was required, the old patterns of sexism kick in again. And women are put either to work in precarious places for half the pay for twice the risk, or they're put into the most, they're put in unpaid caregiving positions within the family. We've started to model around. Initially, the first thing we did was double the Canada Child Benefit for this period. The second thing we've done is that we have provided support through what's known as HRSDC, which is the Human Resources Development Social Canada. It's a French acronym that doesn't work well in English, but we've started to provide some support. But we now know that if we don't step up on family care, which includes child care, but it also looks at seniors care, that we're not going to get women back to work very quickly. And that the women who are working, while some emergency child care is being provided, it's not nearly enough. In many, many social settings, what we're seeing with the COVID crisis is that the pre-existing crises, poverty and a deficient childcare system, as well as homelessness and shelter challenges, all of those gaps that were pre-existing that we were working on to try and solve have been turned into canyons right now as we move forward. So the disappointing answer is that there's no new program around childcare. I mean, we put $750 million in two budgets ago, but we haven't stepped up on new childcare spaces. And it's quite clear to us as a government that as we move towards structuring recovery, that if we're going to make sure that the recovery is not prejudicial against certain demographics, and most importantly women in this situation, and most importantly racialized women in this situation because of the job categories that they often grouped into, we're going to have to step up differently on family care and in particularly child care to get people back to work. But the other thing that has to change as well is equal pay for equal work. The crisis has shown us that people in the service industry were called upon either to work twice as hard or let go twice as fast. And these are areas that are dominated by women with high skills, but with low pay. And this makes childcare even more elusive because of the costs involved. The other component to what we're seeing is in the nonprofit and charitable sectors, which is about a $2.4 billion component of the country's gross domestic product. But 70% of the workers in the nonprofit and charitable sector are women. And this sector has almost entirely shut down as well. Not only have charitable events and charitable giving and nonprofit activities being dramatically impacted in terms of revenue loss, they've also, in many cases, are on the front lines of providing community care and community service. And again, it's an industry that is dominated by women in the employee sector. And this is another place where we've made some investments. We've put together, for example, a $350 million fund that is targeting marginalized organizations in the nonprofit and charitable sector to make sure our frontline services in those communities that are vulnerable are strengthened. So, for example, we worked very closely with African and Black Canadian community organizations to structure this fund and to get it out the door. We also know that the urban Indigenous populations, as an example, fall outside of many traditional funding models. And if they're in funding models, are often marginalized as a subset. And so we've been working to try and build the sector up to get resources there. But at the heart of it all, if you don't have family care, and in particular childcare, it just doesn't work for people. And people have to stay home to take care of little ones or more vulnerable seniors, or other members of their family that need care. And unfortunately, the patterns that we walked into this crisis with have been made more pronounced as we move forward. So it's given our government real, and Parliament and provincial and municipal governments as well, it's given us a real focus and perhaps a better understanding for some people who maybe were reluctant in the past to rethink how we provide the social safety net, and in particular, how we deal with the sexism that intersects with women's lives in the way in which work and work supports are provided.
Thank you. You did mention charities and support that's being made available to charities. We have a question here. How will dispersing agencies qualify which charities receive the funds, and when will the process begin?
So the process has gone live already. 3 major national organizations have been assigned the role of intermediaries. And what we do is we transfer large blocks of, it's a $350 million fund, divided roughly a third, with a bit of a contingency held back at the federal level to plug holes that we see emerging when those 3 fail. But there are 3 national organizations, the Red Cross, Community Foundations of Canada, and the United Way, or Centraide as it's known in Quebec. These 3 organizations have opened up on their websites application processes, which are fairly simple right now because of the need to get dollars out the door. They will be providing support to frontline services doing work in the COVID space. So if you're running a Meals on Wheels program, or if you're a community kitchen, or if you're providing additional support work for isolated seniors, or maybe even translation work for people who don't speak English or French to access government programs. If you're in those areas, they have additional dollars which they can transfer to you, so you can either build services or strengthen services that are providing a COVID response and COVID-related activities. They are prioritizing nonprofits over charities in many ways, because it's very hard to get a charitable number in this country. And most of the new online services or community-based services that serve vulnerable or marginalized communities, whether it's based on immigration status or language, geography is sometimes an issue. There are a lot of different ways to measure it. But we've asked them to report back to us in real time on a sort of a week-by-week basis on how equity-seeking groups are being properly served with these dollars. These dollars were designed to be delivered to equity-seeking groups through the charitable sector, because we know that government programs don't always capture the full matrix of needs in this country, and we know that nonprofits emerge to do the work the government sometimes fails to do, and this was our way of supporting that sector. So if you go on those 3 websites and apply, as I said, equity-seeking groups are being prioritized, and while these 3 organizations have evolved over time and gotten better over time at serving new and emerging voices in our country. We've asked them to report back and to make sure we overrepresent in those areas that we know historically government has underrepresented support for. There's one other program which is very close to launching, which is part of our response to the United Nations Decade on People of the African Diaspora. It's a $25 million 5-year program that was supposed to start last year, but the election got in the way of a quick launch on this. It's a program specifically designed to provide support to the Black and African Canadian communities who deal with anti-Black racism in a systemic way within all of our government programs, and we have to correct that. And part of the way to correct that was to get this fund put in place as part of our anti-racism work, but particular to the Black community. And the goal here is to provide capital to try to create sort of geographical structure or a physical base to many of the programs that we're operating. Those dollars should be out of our ministry very shortly. And we have set up an institute of African and Black Canadians to deal specifically as our intermediary with smaller groups on the ground. And those dollars will be announced very, very shortly, I'm told, by our ministry's office. In fact, that's one of the calls I have to take at 11 o'clock to continue the conversation there. We're very close to getting that going as well. And it's just another example of how our government is trying to layer in additional supports so that you don't end up with a mosaic of supports where you hope you land in one square or the other. But instead, it's sort of a collage of supports where you have multiple opportunities to get the support you need to grow the community-based programs that serve the particular and intersectional needs of different communities across the country.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up for the funding for the charities, do you need to be a member of the United Way or Community Foundations Canada to qualify?
No, in fact, we've asked them to reach outside their usual circuit of support. We recognize entirely that there's a great deal of frustration sometimes, particularly in the regional offices, where new and emerging organizations need sort of 2 years of track records, or sometimes or 3 years, or they need audited statements from. The barriers to entry to full participation in the charitable sector are quite substantial. It's one of the reasons why the Black Institute was being set up. But we're asking them to do things differently, and we've challenged them to do things differently, and they're being held accountable to a reference group of people that helped us within these organizations and made the call for additional support during this critical time. Mm-hmm. So no, the quick answer is no, you don't have to be an existing funding agency.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions around small business owners feeling like they don't meet the requirements for like a loan for $40,000 from their banks, and feeling like they're falling through the cracks. What kind of supports are available for smaller businesses that might not qualify for larger loans?
Yeah, we've relaxed some of the rules around, for example, to get rent support that you no longer have to. Some smaller businesses are mortgage free. We've also started to look at those small businesses that don't have employees but do business nonetheless, and maybe hire contractors to do some of the work on a case-by-case basis. I think you're going to see this week, if not this week, certainly very shortly, a remodeling of some of those supports to accommodate the unique configuration, in particular of emerging businesses or single person or single operator businesses. Those support programs aren't there yet, but we've heard that there is a significant challenge in this area, and so we're starting to model the programs that we launched very quickly, but did it very broadly and tried to create parameters that caught as many as possible. But we're starting to see the exceptionalities, and we're starting to model some responses to that. We're also, Mary Ng, who's the Minister of Small Business, has also heard through sectoral tables that she continues to work with, that there is a different kind of business model, in particular in communities that don't have multi-generational footprints in the country. That there are a lot of new people, new communities whose business leaders emerge with a very low capital base and literally work off the kitchen table sometimes to start a business. That their asset base and their employee model is different, and they run out of personal bank accounts, not out of business bank accounts. That we need to through an intersectional lens and an equity lens, look at some of these emerging businesses and make sure we support those businesses as well. Sometimes they can be supported through CERB, through the income supports, but there also needs to be a remodeling of their business structure in order to get through COVID. And so Marion has been working with finance to try and find ways to modify our programs to accommodate all the different business patterns that exist across the country. But they aren't there yet. But caucus has raised it, Parliament has raised it, and both ministers have promised a response in short order.
Great, thank you so much. Also, concerns about for small business bank loans. Banks are changing their rules and on getting their loans paid back. What if COVID-19 continues for longer than anticipated, and now you're going to have to pay back your bank loan? What's in place for that?
The bank's been a problem, it's one of the reasons we've been so focused on getting support to people and small businesses is that when people and small businesses have money, banks treat them nicely. When banks have the money, they don't necessarily treat small businesses and people very nicely, and it's a challenge. So in 2008, we focused a lot on the economic support going through the financial system, in part because banks were failing. Banks aren't failing at this time. In fact, they're still fairly profitable. And so we've made we've protected the equity markets and the liquidity of the financial system. We have had a great deal of difficulty getting the banks to behave in a more sympathetic way around skipping mortgage payments, skipping loan payments, cutting interest rates on credit cards and what have you. We continue to work with the banks. We continue to put pressure on the banks. I think one of the lessons coming out of this is the credit unions have been very quick to be sympathetic and responsive to their clients. And there's a movement afoot to open some new credit unions in both the Black and the Indigenous communities to try and create an alternative pathway to a more sympathetic pathway to credit and to business support. But we just continue to work in the banks and continue to try and make the banks behave more like neighbors and less like predators. I use a very an unparliamentary description of the banks, and one of the ministers said, "You're being too nice." And I think that all of us have been very frustrated with the way in which banks have operated, especially in seeing how profitable they are. And the recovery is going to have to take that into consideration. And we're looking at the Bank Act now to see how we can leverage more pressure to make the banks behave better. But the reality is that the banks just haven't stepped up as much as they should have.
Mm-hmm. And I think given that your time, you're leaving at 10:30, you said. So I
can give you a few extra minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, so we just have a couple more questions. So questions around the uncertainty of how long this COVID-19 will continue and will we continue to feel the effects of it. So people are asking if the CRERB and other COVID supports will be available, will potentially be extended past. So for example, the CRB, if it'll be extended past the 16-week mark.
Yeah, we're working at the pandemic where there really isn't a timetable. So we sort of put things out in packages that we understand from a financial perspective how they operate. And there will be a need in some cases to either renew or augment or wind down some of these programs as recovery starts to become an option. And as we see province by province, and you can see that it's a very asymmetric impact in terms of where COVID has had its most profound impact. But as different provinces emerge and as different workplaces reopen and as we structure a recovery, there will be, of course, a need to sustain some programs, but there will also be a need to add new ones in. Childcare was one that we talked about earlier. Support for cities is also going to be critically important. If cities have lost their corporate and commercial tax base for the time being, a city like Toronto is losing immense amounts of money week by week. And if we're going to refloat cities, and we're going to have to, they've been doing a lot of heavy lifting during COVID. We're going to have to do it by getting businesses back into a position where they can pay their taxes so that the money floats from the bottom up through the economy to float cities, as opposed to governments sort of running around with a helicopter dropping bags of money everywhere. So the programs will evolve, they will change, they will working well on benefit, partial supports, and also if we have outbreaks, how we close down quickly and kick back in full supports are all going to be have to be part of the thinking. And so you'll see that emerge over time.
Thank you. One question is, I contacted my landlord about commercial rent support program, and they're not doing anything. What options do I have? What should I do?
Yeah, it's a, you know, it's an interesting dilemma that we're facing here. It's really hard for a government to jump into a private contract between a landlord and a tenant and start to muck around with support. So what we put in place was an option, but it requires a good relationship between the landlord and the tenant. There have been some cases where an MP has been called in to try and mediate a solution or start a conversation. One of the things that landlords are going to quickly realize is that if they chase out an existing tenant who's been there for a couple of years or 3 or 4 years, there's not a parade of new businesses lining up to jump into empty storefronts or empty business locations. I appreciate that landlords also have bills to pay and what have you. They've also been given favorable lending terms and deferred taxes and a whole bunch of other stuff from the federal level. So there is some pressure off of landlords, but it's really up to the relationship between the tenant and the landlord to activate the very generous rent support programs that we've put in place in provinces that effectively show that if the landlord reduces the rent for a short period of time, and the tenant comes up with part of the rent for a short period of time, and there's effectively a 50% subsidy for the landlord ready to be paid by the governments of the jurisdiction they're operating in. It doesn't have to be the 25-25-25 splits that we've talked about. You can negotiate different bandwidths on that and different levels of support based on the landlord's needs or the tenant's needs. But it's a program that's been put in place that allows for matching subsidies to be delivered. And the argument that needs to be put to landlords is not so much, how much money are you losing? It's that if they look at over the next 3 years, are they going to have a tenant at all? And if they chase out an existing tenant, they're faced with the proposition of a boarded up store for 3 years. And is 75% of the rent better than zero? Yeah, it is. Is it as nice as 100% of the rent? No, it's not. But one of the things that remind landlords is that there's been all sorts of deferrals put in place and all sorts of other ways to step back into this. But it's really a question of two different business operators negotiating a solution where they both benefit. You're going to run across stubborn landlords, though, and stubborn landlords, from my perspective, won't have any tenants if they're not careful, and that's part of the argument that we thought would trigger a more aggressive uptake of this program, but it clearly hasn't happened just in some individual cases.
Thank you. What, if any, help is there now for homeless people living in tents and shelters? How are they going to social distance, and what happens if they get sick?
So we have a few outbreaks in the Toronto shelter system, largely unfortunately in the riding I represent, and we've seen an increase in people sleeping rough and sleeping in tents. There were a couple of agencies that were actually handing out tents, which is one of the reasons you've seen more of them dotted around our communities. Social distancing inside the shelter system in Toronto at the best of times is virtually impossible. It's one of the reasons tuberculosis is making a comeback. And the other side of it is that we know that we haven't, the borders aren't entirely sealed, and we still have people crossing from the States, largely from U.S. cities into Canadian cities, and that's brought some of the challenges in America north of the border. That's why the first major outbreak in one of the homeless shelters was in a shelter that specializes in dealing with refugee and immigrant arrivals who are in need of shelter. So what we did is we doubled our federal funding and removed all rules and regulations allowing shelters to acquire space as they needed to help distance. We have relaxed a significant number of the healthcare rules and regulations because many homeless people have addiction or mental health issues. They're very difficult clients to isolate. We have stepped up on the funding around violence against women shelters as well, because we know that domestic violence is unfortunately one of the significant byproducts of isolation and homestay. And so we have been supporting cities acquiring the new hotel spaces and supporting the outreach work to coach people into safer environments. That being said, we also have in Toronto about 250, we think, cases. It's about 10% of the provincial total. Sorry, not 10%. It's about, we have about 10% of the national population of homeless people, but it's a significant population of people who we believe have tested positive for COVID. Some of the reporting mechanisms are a little challenging because people sleep in different shelters from night to night and may show up and be counted twice. The city doesn't do a great job at tracking stuff in Toronto, but our support to the homeless sector has been that doubling up of the dollars and releasing all the rules so they can respond to COVID in real time. We've coordinated to include the homeless shelters in the national health guidelines so that provinces have the capacity to make sure PPE and sanitizing and supports are there. We have a very strong set of health teams and health guidelines for frontline medical providers to do screening and testing inside the shelter system. We've been very fortunate so far in terms of the fatalities, but we're watching it carefully because of underlying medical conditions. But the challenge we're having is that cities have chosen to rent hotel rooms largely at about $100 a day, and that's pushing the cost of this space into places that's very unaffordable. We've been working on a plan to get cities to acquire distressed apartments and failing motels and hotels to create a more permanent solution so that again, one of the crises we walked into this crisis with was homelessness. It's one of the files I've been working on. We're now looking at the recovery as being a way of actually ending homelessness for many individuals. It's unconscionable and I think immoral for us to think about putting people in a hotel for 2 months while we get them and protect their health, and then all of a sudden saying you're fine, go back onto the streets. So we have heavy lifting to do here. It was work we were committed to doing before the COVID crisis. With the new dollars that are making their way around governments these days, we're trying to focus cities into staging permanent solutions to homelessness. And you saw a new housing program for 240 units in Toronto just announced last week to try and model the national housing strategy, the COVID response strategy, and our homelessness supports into a program to create permanent supportive housing and hopefully make a real dent in ending homelessness quickly, but certainly meeting our target of ending it by 2030.
Thank you. And another question is, if a person's workplace is open to work at home and a person chooses not to work due to the fact that the person has a 4-year-old son with medical issues and they applied for CRB, does that person have to pay back the CRB?
No, it's somebody who's due to COVID-related issues has lost work and they're entitled to the benefit. They have to pay tax on it. And if you're not working for a long period of time, that tax load will be very small, but keep an eye on that and talk to people who do your taxes. And there are a couple of online calculators that kind of, if you go online and look for them, you can sort of start to guess at what you might have to pay tax on. But the longer you're off, the lower that tax load will be. But no, the other issue is return to work. If the job site that you're working at reopens and you don't think it's safe for you or your family, that is still a reason. You may be in a tricky spot with your employer depending on that conversation. Most employers are not bringing everybody back all at once, but you should be in touch with your employer to specify what the job sensitivities are, what the health risks are, and see if you can't work out a method of return that either gets you reemployed or puts you in a position where you're off work because of CERB and therefore you qualify for some of the benefits. It's a new area of employment law. My partner happens to be a human resources manager for a firm that straddles the US-Canadian border. In fact, it's a global company, and they're just coming to terms with who should and shouldn't return and what new health categories or risks may be presented to employers that need to be accommodated. So start that conversation with your employer now. Identify the risks immediately and see what reasonable accommodation may be achievable. And if it's not achievable, we understand that as a government, and that's one of the reasons stepping out of those income supports is going to have to be done with an eye to health.
And the last question we have for you is, will you start collecting stats on COVID cases based on demographics and ethnicity as they're doing in the US?
Yeah, no, it's at the national level. When we broadened the long form, when we took over government in 2015, we immediately broadened the long form census to start acquiring the full data sets that we need to understand how different government programs and different natural phenomena and different social pressures were impacting different people in different ways. One of the first conversations we had on the poverty reduction strategy was with a group of Black academics who spelt out through their hard work and the sort of the detective work they had to do to draw any kind of data that was specific to the area of studies that they were involved in, required us on particularly on health and social determinants of health and the impact of poverty on health to start collecting this data. One of the reasons that we set up the Institute of African Canadian Black organizations, part of that group is a group of academics which are going to teach us how to and make recommendations and criticize our lack of ability in some areas to make sure we have enriched data so that we have we can understand what a disease's impact is on Indigenous women or on African Canadians with a disability or on women who work in the healthcare sector and what their immigration status is and what that means for their progress professional, whose degrees are being recognized, whose aren't, and where we have to do more work. Our government believes in evidence and science and data. We have heard quite clearly from the academic community where we're missing. And we also know that there are institutional biases within our governments that pre-existed long before COVID and long before the census was attacked. We need those statistics. We can see in the United States that there has been, and when we talk to family in Brooklyn or New Jersey in the tri-state area, we know that there has been a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities, but we also know within that there has been even a more phenomenal impact on who are the frontline workers, why are they the frontline workers, what are the economic conditions and professional criteria that put someone who's got, I had a call from someone in my riding. She's originally from Nigeria. She trained in England. She worked in the British health system, but she can't get her credentials recognized here. And it's all well and fine for Haley Wickenheiser with a hockey stick to jump the queue from a first, second year medical student right to the front lines in an ICU. But you've got people who've done open heart surgery in Egypt, but can't act as a doctor in Canada, and they aren't being enrolled in the healthcare services right now. There's a whole series of data sets that we need to understand to allow people with talent to use those talents to serve themselves and Canadians, but also we need to understand what proximity to a healthcare system looks like and what impact that has in someone's health. We need to understand when people are slotted into sort of job categories that are very complicated. We need to understand what that pathway looks like, what the implications around health look like, and what we have to do as a country to create more equitable outcomes and allow people to use their talents. If we don't collect data on race and on gender, on socioeconomic status, on immigration status, and disaggregate that data and allow people to play with it to understand where exceptionalities exist, we can't do good government policy, and our government policies reinforce historic inequities. And in this day and age, there's no defense for that. And so we are broadening, detailing, and consulting and using the good academic voices coming from different communities to get better data all the time so that we can serve people in a better way. And hopefully that creates stronger outcomes, stronger programs, but at the end of the day, citizens with more rights. And that's the goal of all of this work. COVID has shown why it's lethal not to do that. It's dangerous not to do that. And hopefully the changes that we embrace now will be changes that will benefit people in a whole range of different spaces in a much more pronounced way going forward. And that means that we get people in a better space. And that's our job in government, is to make your life easier, not to make it harder.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We definitely recognize the struggle that many foreign trained professionals have when trying to enter the workspace in Canada and have their credentials recognized. And this is kind of the work that we do in our organization with our foreign recognition program. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to be done there. I definitely agree with you there. And I think COVID-19 has really shown us why it's important to be doing this work. So thank you so much for coming today and answering all the questions that we had. This was really informative session, and we really appreciate your time, the time you took from your busy schedule today. So at this time, this would bring us to the end of the webinar. Thank you all for attending the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and we'll share it via email with you. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share with your network, as a lot of people have many of these same questions that were answered today by Mr. Vaughan. You'll also receive a webinar evaluation. We'd really appreciate your feedback to assist us in planning future webinars. And our upcoming webinars are what to do when your bills are due, which is on May 19th. And you can find out more information about our upcoming webinars on our website, accessccf.com. Thank you so much, Mr. Vaughan, and thank you everyone for attending today. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you a lot. Bye-bye.